Yes, good evening, Dr. Tom Sunic in Zagreb, Croatia. How are you?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your invitation. And I'd like to extend my best regards to our friends, colleagues, comrades down under, and certainly I'm at your service.
Good. I thought I might actually start tonight's chat. We always get a lot of very positive feedback, and for the Australian audience, it's often good to get a different perspective on parts of continental European politics. One thing that I've been asked quite a lot by people is how people in your country are perceiving the tendency towards European government centralism. Croatia is a member of the European Union now. How are they actually perceiving what's occurring in the Brussels bureaucracy? What do people see?
Well, I assume that our listeners and our viewers are aware of the fact that the European Union is a huge apparatus. It's a mega machine. It employs over 40,000 people, both consultants, advisors. And basically, the European Union has been under severe strain lately, primarily over the issue of the conflict in Ukraine and, of course, over the issue of the Israeli engagement in Palestine. And I think I need to single out a rather important fact that the European Union is not a unified body. There are some dissenting voices, and we can hear that. We can see it on a daily basis. That's almost prime news in Croatia and elsewhere. But Hungary and the Prime Minister Orban is a very popular figure among quote-unquote some nationalists and right-wingers all over Europe. And one thing we also need to underline is that Orban is very critical of the European Union, primarily of the European Commission. And of course, he has very good ties with President Trump in the United States of America. So please always keep that in mind in terms of some putative or hypothetical problems in Central Europe, and specifically in the Balkans where I live. He might, I'm just taking a wild guess, he might play an important role. Now, of course, as far as Hungary is concerned, we also need to add here Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They have been, to some extent, they've been quite critical of over the European Union engagement in Ukraine. And we're talking here big bucks, we're talking big money. The European Union over the last 3 years has funneled over $150 billion of euros, equivalent to euros, to Ukraine, to Zelensky's government. And of course, the United States of America has also dished out literally the same sum. So we're talking almost $250 billion altogether. So by and large, in terms of the psychology of Europeans, in terms of the psychology of people here in Croatia, where I live, people are getting a little bit tired, and it's almost like a battle fatigue by proxy rather. And I don't really know how this is going to play out in the near future. But by and large, we need to say that Hungary plays now a very strong role in its criticism and its critique of the European Union. As far as the European Union is concerned, I guess we could debate about this for quite some time. Keep in mind, this is basically a mega machine, as I said at the beginning. And the problem from the American perspective is that there is not a single locus of power in Brussels. There are many quote-unquote segments of power. So folks, even academics, let alone just simple folks, they ask themselves the question, what's the purpose? What's the goal of the European Union, given the fact that they haven't been able over the last 30 years to solve any major problem? First, let's start with 1993-94, during the war and the disintegration of ex-communist Yugoslavia. They weren't able to put a stop to the war. It was a brutal war. And now, of course, we have Ukraine, and which is also a neighboring country of Hungary and Poland. So they're talking about state, which is the size approximately of Texas or France, approximately. And again, the European Union has not been able to solve any major issue regarding the cessation of this conflict. I don't know if I could harp on it a little bit longer. I guess let's keep in mind it's an irony of history that the European Union was launched, in 1955. It had a different name, by the United States of America.
Yeah.
It's a Schumann and Monet. They are
Yeah.
called, in these textbooks. You learn that they were the architects of the European Union, but basically they were American agents.
Yeah.
So the interest of the United States of America is following the Second World War to smooth over those nationalist resentments among different European nations. So whether this was good or bad, I leave that up to your viewers. And I certainly would like to add one important item, namely that the European Union without Germany is an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. Like the core, the foundation of the European Union is Germany. After all, Germany foots the tab of almost 1/3 of the European budget is financed by the German taxpayers, over, I guess, about the European Union budget is about $250 billion or euros approximately, and I guess the Germans are the ones who bear the brunt of it. And
do you think that this war in Ukraine has actually revived fundamental issues inside Europe between the countries, that there is actually a fractured view now on this war, and where does this go in terms of European centralism?
I guess that's a very sensitive question, I must tell you. I don't want to take sides here because I don't want to sound biased, neither in terms of neither on behalf of the Ukrainians or, for that matter, the Russians. But the fact of the matter is, we have to look at the genealogy of the conflict, and I again think will take us hours. And the war didn't start just with the plain aggression of the Russians 3 years back. And when was that? 3 years back exactly. It actually started, if you wish, with the administration of Clinton, and then Obama, and then Biden. In 1915, in 1914, we know what happened at the Maidan Square. Prior to that, you had numerous American politicians, senators, including, I can't keep track of all those names, including that big lady Nuland, and conservatives, including those big shots that were coming to Ukraine, and they were literally, they were inciting the Ukrainian population in terms of using a very anti-Russian slogans. I guess in those circumstances, of course, the Russians reacted in their own fashion. And again, I don't want to take the sides of the Russians here, but the war started much, much, much earlier, not just with the plain aggression, as I said, by the Russians several years back. So I'm pretty much sure that President Trump, and I give him certain credit. Look, I don't want to now take sides, but I appreciate what he is doing in terms of, I don't want to say stalling, or rather being a little bit careful as far as the taking the anti-Russian side completely. He's trying to negotiate that. I guess tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, the Secretary of State Rubio is going to meet Lavrov, who is very educated, very eloquent Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, who speaks several languages and speaks English very well. So I presume they will come to some agreement. And I guess if somebody is to be blamed, I will have to start again with the European Union. Again, we know what the European Union is all about. It's basically the vassal type of a structure that was launched in 1955 by the United States of America. And then an additional factor are the American neocons, who actually started that war almost 20 years back, I guess. So the whole picture.
Is it a case, Tom, that various people you think in some of the European countries, I'll ask you to mention Croatia specifically, are looking at this war as coercion by the Brussels bureaucracy to get an outcome? Maybe they want different outcomes like Orban wants in Hungary or Fico in Slovakia. They look for different outcomes or a more balanced outcome. And how can they negotiate inside what you call this massive machine to get something different to what's actually occurred?
I'd like to synthesize, and I would like to compound my answers in one brief and concise comment, but I think I might still need some more time. Now, again, as I said, sir, I don't want to take sides here. I'm, of course, a Croat, an American Croat, and I certainly don't want to be accused of taking anti-Serbian sides. Of course, there are certain parallels we can draw between the conflict in Ukraine and Russia and the former conflict between Serbs and Croats. And again, I need to tell you that, and this is actually the prime news right now in Croatia. This is probably not hitting the Australian news now. There's a big debate now going on in Belgrade, in Croatia. Well, let me put it bluntly, there is a verbal civil war going on right now in Croatia. And again, the multitude of different parallels being drawn between the conflict in Ukraine versus Russia and former conflict, military conflict between Serbia and Croatia, or rather Yugoslavia and Croatia. And I frankly do not know where to start. Let me just tell you one thing. And again, I might probably sound like the spokesman of now the European Union at this stage. Let me just backpedal a little bit. The European Union was launched early on with the Treaty of Rome back in '55, and the prime reason was to stop, to hinder, to erase those nationalist feelings, which have cost us dearly. Let's be quite clear about this. Despite the fact that I'm proud of being of white origin, of European origin, whatever we wish, let's realize that over their history, and especially over the last 200 years, and especially over the last 100 years, the European states have been constantly in war with each other, with our first-door neighbor. So I call it basically a negative type of identity, both on the side of as far as the Serbs are concerned, or the Croats. Most of my colleagues here in Croatia basically frame their identity on their hatred against the Serbs. And I sometimes wonder, this is a rhetorical question, as I said, sir, I got to be very careful because I don't want to hurt the feelings of some of my viewers in Australia of Croatian origin, or for that matter, the feelings of some of the Australians of Serbian origin. But the fact of the matter is, we need to ask ourselves, what is our priority right now? Is our priority the fact that Croatia has, as of now, 40,000 people who are of non-European origin, parts of Zagreb in the last year are unrecognizable. In one last year, you just take a walk, 10 minutes for a live, you see the Nepalese, the Filipinos, the cheap labor coming from different part of South Asian basin. And then you start wondering, just as a simple man, a Joe Sixpack, what the heck is going on? Am I going to spend my whole life, demonizing the Serbs, and vice versa, by the way, or exaggerating with the Serbian body counts during the Second World War, hallucinating about 700,000 people, Serbs, that's the way many of their historians argue. Or should I be a little bit more concerned about the fact that the ethnic and the demographic composition, or the racial composition, is radically changing all over Europe? Once upon a time, 2 years back, Croatia, Serbia, Hungary certainly, Slovakia, they have very solid, borders, by the way, were considered the very more European than Western European states. But as of now, as I told you now, graphically, I could show you, I could send you some pics. There are parts of the large cities in large towns in Croatia I can no longer recognize. I need to recap that. Over the last 2 years, there has been a massive inflow of foreign cheap labor, primarily from South Asia. Something what France and Germany went through 60 or 50 years back. Now Croatia, being the member of the Schengen, being the member of the European Union, in other words, you can travel now without passport to Paris, to Finland, anywhere you want to, because we are now in this glorious European Union type of entity, so we don't need paperwork, to fill out or whatever, like you do when you travel to Australia or Germany.
As you found out, yes.
Yes. But on the other hand, of course, let's face it, I don't want to blame those Filipinos, or for that matter, the Bangladeshis. There are quite a few of them. There are quite a few of Nepalese. Came all the way from Kathmandu, I went there when I was a hippie long time back, I know, when we had smoked joints or whatever, Anyway, long story. But now things are not romantic at all, because those poor folks, I feel sorry for them in a way. They're also being exploited. Why? Because there are many big time Croats. I know them firsthand. They like waving their flags. They like, sporting their nationalist feelings. They like, hollering against the Serbs. All due respect, folks. You got to do that. That's fine. I agree with that. But at the same time, they're bringing in this cheap labor. Why? Because many young Croats, honky Croats, if you wish. I'm sorry to be a little bit more explicit, white Croats, and I need to, because I'm getting a little bit emotional. I'd rather, have to tone down. At the same time, they're hiring cheap labor. Why? Because, nobody wants to do some dirty work. So I guess Australia is going through it. Australia has been going through this population replacement over the last 50 years, but now is the turn of Croatia, to some extent of Serbia as well. Serbia is not yet a member of the European Union, but this is inevitably what's in store for us once we become part and parcel of the European Union. Free flow of capital and people. That's typically capitalist type of a slogan. You cannot have capitalism, you cannot have growth unless you import cheap labor. And this is exactly what's happening right now. Again, let me just close the door just a second. I'm sorry about this. It was just a short interruption. I wanted. Let me just specify, sir. I just want to make sure that I'm crystal clear about some of my statements. And if there are some problems, let me know. I can recap them. I probably put them in a different wording. But I presume I'm quite clear and I'm quite. Indeed. Yes. So again, let me, as far as nationalism is concerned, look, the big story now. It's really. I'm getting a little bit worried. Things are not very good in Croatia. It's a safe country, it's a beautiful country, good women, everything fine, nice coast. Just last week we went for a swim in Split down there. It was a big rally in Split the other day, because right now there is, as I said, a verbal civil war going on, and this is considering the Serbian victimology and Croatian victimology. I think I said that, sir, once at your show. The Serbs' official Serbian narrative states that about 500,000 Serbs were killed during the Croatian Ustašas, Croatian fascists, during the Second World War in different concentration camps. Now, the Croatian official narrative, and I'm talking about people who are also mostly very liberal and leftist on, is that only 80,000 people were killed by the Ustašas. Now, Croatian revisionists, and the other day they had a big conference. Can you imagine the parliament, which is something unimaginable in Germany, or for that matter in France, unimaginable even in Australia, down under. There was a big debate that some Croatian revisionists, I know some of them personally, and I respect their work, they said, no way, Jose. In fact, there was a very heated discussion going on among scholars, between scholars and among scholars. And some of those people, including Mr. Vukic, whom I know well, he said no more than several hundred Serbs were killed by the Croatian fascists. Now, can you imagine this stigmatization, both this way or that way, is still part of the narrative in Croatian and in the Serbian media. And of course, may sound very, how can I say, very neutral from all perspectives, sir. But it can morph into a very, very bad, how can I say, bad consequences. So again, sir, if I can just pull back a little bit, we are still suffering from the legacy of the Second World War. If you want to understand what's going on in Europe, be it Serbs and Croatia, be it Ukrainians and Russians, you have to start dismantling and remantling the narrative that was established after the Second World War in 1945. Unless we do that, we'll definitely have those verbal infighting, which may, just like it's happening right now in Ukraine and Russia, may have some very bad consequences. So again and again, we got to ask ourselves a question: who benefits from it? On my personal side, we can now claim that we don't want to have those fratricidal inter-white wars, but the fact of the matter is, look, with all due respect I might have for some Australian nationalists, and with all due respect I may have for some of people, attending big conferences about how we got to revive our legacy, European white legacy, but the fact of the matter is there is still this subterranean type of resentment between the Ukrainians and Russian nationalists, between the Finnish nationalists and the Russian nationalists, and between Serbian nationalists and Croatian nationalists. And I don't have much, I'm not very optimistic, sir, to start with. And again, considering what has been going on over the last 100 years, I don't want to harbor any big-time hopes about the solution. I would like this to be solved, but as I said,
you raised an interesting point earlier when you mentioned President Trump and some of his interventions in Europe, etc. Can I ask you a devil's advocate question? You have written a marvelous book, Homo Americanus, and you've looked at the psychology of America. In fact, I was talking to one of my close comrades today, and we were talking about the United States, and she said to me that the place wasn't really founded as a Christian country because all of the people who wrote the Constitution were deists. Anyway, we had an interesting conversation about that, and then she asked me a question. She said, do you think that President Trump himself is representative of Homo Americanus, and is that an issue or a problem in him relating to Europe, for and against it, to try to work out some solutions, particularly over things like the Ukraine war? In your opinion, objective opinion, is he actually, unfortunately for himself, representative of a trend in America that's actually a negative trend?
Well, you're asking me a question, and I guess it's also an emotional question. I prefer him. I don't want to say I'm an admirer of him, but I certainly support his policies, particularly as far as the European is concerned. The European Union, he's quite critical of the European Union. This morning, I don't know if you follow that, the news, he commended and he saluted and he commended the BBC for firing two big-time shots who are actually doctoring up stories about his support of Capitol protesters back in 91, right? So this is the big time news, and also on the BBC. And I'm glad that he's the first one who launched this battle against fake news. Let's be clear about this. The very fact that he's critical of the CNN, ABC, and different quote unquote mainstream channels, elicits some sympathy, It's at least as far as I'm subjectively concerned, and I certainly like his attitude towards the media. I'm also, to some extent, I'm also supportive of his attitude towards Russia, and I guess he's very careful, unlike the Europeans who have just cheated on that. They're not doing very well. This lady who is in charge of the commissar, it's a lady of Finnish extraction. I'll tell you, her name is Kaja Kallas.
Kallas, yeah.
Well, just look at her pedigree. You know who her dad is, Who was a KGB agent. She's just tiny in her career. She's a good-looking lady, probably. I don't want to sound like a macho or whatever, but I really think that her mind is really limited. The problem is, she's got the whole machinery behind her,
Yes.
This guy, Rutte, was a former big shot in the Dutch government. I mean, when you listen to this guy, the way he articulates his thoughts, then you wonder what type of freaks, should I use that? What type of people are presenting to Europeans, let alone this lady von Leyen. None of them were elected in the first place. What do they know about the tragedy of those people? So basically they feed, and I'll tell you, they literally feed on the complicity and on naivete, complicity, and also on fatigue of people all over Europe. We should probably get a little bit more active. Folks in Australia. I guess you should probably do that likewise with your politicians. I don't have a very high opinion of your politicians to start with.
None at all.
Let me tell you one thing, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I want to sound quite politically correct because I might be traveling to Australia, so I don't want to be barred from entering the country.
No.
I mean, everybody's up in arms about the death toll in Ukraine, about young kids getting killed, and bombardment, Russian bombardment. But wait. Over 60,000 people were killed in Gaza. And nobody pipes up a single word about this, including Trump himself. Yes. So this is where I'm in quite some disagreement with Trump's administration as far as Israel is concerned. If you want to be objective, please don't use double standards. I mean, whatever I may think about Arabs or Muslims, whatever, I'm certainly not a Muslim. I was raised in a Catholic strong, whatever. But these are people, these are human beings, If any other country had conducted such a large-scale massacre like the Netanyahu's government, believe it, they would have been wiped off the earth, in one single bombing round, Look, they're getting money. They're getting $4 billion by American taxpayers, including me. You're not even supposed to say a damn word about that. You're not even supposed to. Some folks do. Like, I appreciate what Tucker said, and this guy, he's got at least the balls to say a couple of things. And even that lady from Georgia, she's a congressman. She had. But people are afraid of saying certain things. So ironically, look at the irony of history. Now the left has more courage, civil courage, to phrase, to say, to formulate certain thoughts that conservatives or right-wingers are afraid of sputtering or voicing or uttering, rather uttering. Again, as I said, just as much as I agree with President Trump on many, many issues, I have certain skepticism as far as his approach to Israel is concerned. I think that he knows deadly well what's going on, but we know the game, we know what the situation is with the Jewish lobby, with the Israeli, let's put it more euphemistic, with the Israeli lobby in the United States of America. So you got to be, of course, careful. Of course, we have the First Amendment over there, so you can say lots of things that you wouldn't say in Australia, in Melbourne, for that matter, or for that matter, in front of the Parliament down in Sydney, like folks clad in black, whatever. But you can lose your position. I know it firsthand if you start, rocking the boat and just raising certain issues about the Israeli involvement, about the money American taxpayers spend. Here we have another paradox. So the healthcare in the United States of America, of course, it's not free like in Europe, or for that matter in Australia. You got to pay big bucks, even for a minor checkup, blood checkup. But look how much money they spend every year for Israel. So you could probably take care of everything. Anyway, these are very, very tough issues. I guess I would probably like to revert a little bit to Serb-Croat conflict, but please feel free to ask me provocative questions. As I said,
I've got a couple more for you.
Sure. I'd like to avoid my value judgments, and look, I am a cultural pessimist. I think I said that on many occasions on your show. And I'm aware of the fact that even if Europeans, white Europeans, if you wish, even if Croats, if they get rid of Serbs, or for that matter, they get rid of the putative Jewish danger or whatever, financial danger, we will start killing each other. Because in Europe, unfortunately, despite the fact that I'm a great fan of Homer and I read Ovid very much, and I read Aeneid and Aeneas very much. I'm reading reading those myths. I've been involved with those. To some extent, I consider myself even an expert on those old Greek myths. But the fact of the matter is, we've been constantly in war with our first door neighbor. We're not talking about the second door neighbor, but the first door neighbor.
Yeah.
So how do you want to stop the war? How do you want to establish this white, glorious society, white homeland, when you're going to start next door a war with your first door neighbor? Anyway,
that's bad. Yeah, bad European history. Actually, I'll run another one past you, and which you might find interesting. I understand that the Croatian government is going to institute military conscription.
Mm-hmm.
I heard a story about this the other day, and there was an article in the Australian press that which I read somewhere, that said that there are people in Australia with dual Croatian-Australian citizenships. And I read some commentaries by, I'll say, some decent human beings. And this is my turn to say to you, don't get me wrong with what I say. Very, very, very decent human beings who migrated to Australia from Croatia. And they were talking about diasporas. And they were talking about how people have to, consider what's going to happen with military service and things along those lines. And there was one person who talked about how many people in the world are part of the Croatian diaspora. Now, I know that you've lived in the United States. I know you have US citizenship, if I know correctly. And take Australia for argument's sake, the way Australia was settled and whatever. We have a doctrine here that proclaims multiculturalism, and Australia's evolved over time. And like you, I believe in white states, white countries. As a loyal Croatian person, what happens in your estimation if a person in Australia has Croatian background somewhere? Grandfather might be Croatian, maybe all of his parents are Croatian, but he says, look, I'm not really a Croatian, I'm actually an Australian. My loyalty is to Australia alone. And I think in a certain way, I think like Australians, I regard myself as Australian. My contact with Croatia is my grandparents. How do you believe there'd be these issues would be negotiated through in what's euphemistically called a Croatian community in Australia? And I say this because the organisation I'm in has many people who have partial Croatian backgrounds and so on, but they consider themselves simply to be Australians. White, number one, and two, I'm an Aussie, right? How do you think that plays out in the smaller world of, shall we call it, ethnic politics? What do you think?
You've raised two issues, rather. The first one is of dual citizenship and dual loyalty. I guess that's something we also need to grapple with. I guess sometimes, what can I tell you? It's a different dilemma also for me. I'm on the horns of the dilemma as well, because, of course, I must admit that I'm very happy now that Trump is running the show in the United States of America, and I feel certainly much more inclined to America and Americanism than I felt during the Biden's mandate, or for Biden, or for that matter, Obama's mandate. I couldn't identify with America at that time. So again, It's the issue of identity we need to solve first, And how can you talk about identity in a globalist world, where people are witnessing on the daily basis the racial changes of absolute dramatic proportions. One half of the United States citizens, we are talking about 50% of US citizens, are now of non-European origin.
Yes.
How do you want to define Homo Americanus now, as opposed to Homo Americanus when I first came there in the early 80s, 83, when I came to the States and then obtained my citizenship, when 85% of American citizens were of European white origin. So I wonder, my friends, my colleagues, and I could enumerate quite a few of them. I might be actually traveling there and give a couple of lectures right now. How do they identify themselves with the country? Where do they come from? How do they actually, where do they want to go in case of emergency? We'll come to the passports soon. And no wonder that even some of my colleagues, I don't want to mention their names, even from America, the United States of America, asking me, Tom, how can we get a U.S. passport? The Croats, born in America, even second and third generation, this is what the Croatian law allows you to hold 3 passports if you wish. So even folks from Argentina of Croatian background, second, third, fourth generation, even in Argentina has a large Croatian community. Canada has a large Croatian community. In South Africa, there are some as well. In Germany, there are 500,000 of them. They're allowed, they may not speak a single word of the Croatian language, but according to our constitution, they can ask, in fact, they can get, it takes some time, but even the proficiency in the Croatian language is not common. In fact, just the other day, I spoke to a guy who obtained of distant Croatian origin from California, from Santa Cruz, who came over, and his wife is an American of non-Slavic or non-Croatian origin, but they live here, they're quite happy. Some countries do not allow you that. Germany, at least 10 years back, you were not allowed to have 2 or 3 passports. But as of now, you're allowed to have. So again, we have to come to the core point, which is globalism. Many Jews in the United States of America, or rather Americans of Jewish ancestry, they're allowed to have an Israeli passport. That's nothing new. I don't know how many congressmen of Jewish extraction in the United States of America have the U.S. citizenship, but again, they can get it. So again, we have to address the point of globalism and capitalism before we start talking about what my new identity is and what my identity is not. I'm certainly not as happy, and my image of Croatia back in 91, 92 was quite different from what it is right now. I do not like the way things go. I don't like this ultra-capitalism, this greed for money, or this obsession with how to get rich. And what worries me most, and I certainly would like to urge my fellow Croats down in Melbourne or Geelong or whatever in Crete, be aware of the fact that Croatia is racial, demographically. I will not use the term racial because it's no longer popular. It's no longer politically correct. So I will use the term ethnicity. So I'll use ethnicity. Okay, ethnicity. It's just radically changing. It's no longer as secure as it used to be.
So, if I could just slip back to that point, as a loyal Croatian man, if I can use that term, it doesn't obviously disturb you in the workings of identity that there might be someone with a name that is a Croatian name, but he would say to you, "No, I'm not a Croatian, Tom. I'm actually an Australian." That doesn't disturb you.
Well, that's perfectly legit, and I presume there are also people in the United States of America. There's 1.5 million of folks of Croatian ancestry. Well, look, you just got to ask yourself a question. To what benefit, to what use? Folks do not necessarily flock to Australia because they want to read, what is this guy, Ned Sambiga, form a new national consciousness. They flock there, they flock to the United States of America because they want a big bucks. They want to make a big money. And if things start changing, if certain things hit the fan, they will change their, the old Latin proverb. It's just patria. Wherever it's good, that's where my homeland is. So
that's right. No, it's just an interesting question because I know that in some of the material that you've written, you've often discussed identity, and it can be an evolving thing. And
Yes.
obviously, Australia, like Argentina, like the original United States or whatever, was a colonial country that had diverse European stocks that migrated there. And it was, you'd probably agree that it was inevitable that some identity arises that's transcendent of the stocks that came. So an Irishman in America would say, sorry, I'm an American, or an Italian in Argentina would say, sorry, I'm an Argentinian now. That sort of thing, evolving identity.
Sure, but this raises a very specific question. What does it mean to declare yourself, I'm proud of being an American, say aloud?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
In light of the fact that the United States of America over the last 30 years has dramatically changed.
Yeah.
You know, not just Chicago, every large city has the New York City has one third are people of European white origin, 2/3 of non-European origin.
Yes.
LA is the same.
Yeah.
Albuquerque and New Mexico, for that matter, for Miami. I mean, all large cities, Chicago.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chicago has also 2/3 of people who are of non-European origin. Yeah.
Yes.
So you got to understand the point. I have folks, colleagues that are asking me a question, Tom, how do I define myself? What's my identity now in this postmodern world where, look, we may disagree on many issues, sir. We may disagree even on some political issues. But let me look at this from the evolutionary perspective, if I may. And I'd like to quote, Rushdown and Kevin McDonald, a friend of mine, and so on. Let me just graphically put it that way. You take a subway in New York, or for that matter, take a subway in London. And late at night, even during the day, you won't see very many people of European ancestry, you know. London has 50% of people who are foreigners. And again, you feel so instinctively late at night when you see a couple of white faces, whatever European face, you feel a little bit more secure than when you travel alone, especially if you're a woman, late at night, and if you see all people from Jamaica or different parts of the world and not a single white face. You know, this is something we don't want to discuss about. This is something incredibly important.
Yes.
Very, very much important. I don't want to eulogize now. I don't want to romanticize now the whites. You know, I told you something about my misgivings that I have about this constant tribal wars we've been going through, you know, all over Europe. The Flemish against the Walloons, the Poles in Silesia and Pomerania against the Germans, and the Germans against the Poles, the Russians against the Ukrainians. This is, you know, mind-boggling, and this is shameful for all of us. But at the same time, from the purely biological perspective, I'm trying to use very simple lingo, sir. When I travel by bus or when I travel by train, let's say in Chicago or someplace, when I see the profile of the passengers who more or less, you know, fit into my ethnic category, I feel a little bit more at ease.
Yeah, of course.
I feel a little bit more. I don't want to say that those are good white guys. Probably some of them are weirdos, or some of them are junkies, or what have you. But you feel a little bit more at ease. And I guess this is something, and I would like to advise all over again, in social sciences, we have completely neglected this evolutionary biological perspective. That's very, very important. You can't just study political science 101, you know, political science 101, or for that matter, sociology or literature, unless you also look at the behavioral genetics. So that's a good word, behavioral genetics. It's an incredibly important field. It has been completely neglected in Australia, in Europe, in Germany in particular. To some extent, you have this course, behavioral genetics, in American universities. But even those scholars that I'm familiar with are being looked down upon. So again, this obsession with that we're all equal means that we can be equally dismissed and just one, like Stalin did. You know, Stalin, communists, what they killed millions, hundreds of millions, and 60,000, whatever, you know, millions and millions of people because they thought that they could crank out new ones, new Homo Sovieticus or Homo Americanus. It doesn't work that way, you know.
No,
I'm
not at all.
You know.
Okay, can I ask you?
I'm venerating, that I'm eulogizing the whites. You know, some of the worst people I've met are my fellow Croats.
Well, I could say the same about my fellow Australians.
Yeah,
I take it that you're very busy on the conference circuit, etc. at the moment. Are you attending various meetings in Europe, and you indicated that you have a meeting coming up soon that you wanted us to advertise?
Yes, well, thank you very much. Look, I told you about the identity. I guess I pride myself on the fact that I'm familiar and that I'm also very fluent in the German language and the French language and the Croatian language, other than the English language, which is like a lingua franca. Had I been born a little bit earlier, like 100 years earlier, I would have probably spoken Latin very well, like my dad did. I became a priest because I was also intended to be ordained as a priest, as a Catholic. I would have spoken. I'm fascinated with people who are multilingual and who are polyglots, as we say. And again, why I'm telling you that, because on the 27th, I have a speech I'll have a presentation of my book, which has been published in German, Homo Americanus and Kinder Postmoderne, in the German language. And I got to tell you, in terms of my identity, it's my secondary identity. I love the German language. I love the German literature. I was raised with Nietzsche, on Nietzsche and with Nietzsche. I was raised on Carl Schmitt, the great jurist, the great legal scholar. I was raised, I must tell you, Heidegger was a little bit different because difficult. I read him twice, in German and in English, but he used very hermetic language, by the way. I love Ernst Jünger. I read it entirely in the German language. I like this compound nouns in the German language. That's so beautiful. It's so fantastic. So again, you ask me now about my identity. I don't know. My grandparents fought in the 70-year war between Prussia and again, civil war, brothers against brothers. Prussia between Friedrich II and Maria Theresa. When they fought in the 30 Years' War, the Cross was also there.
It's a mess.
I would have probably ended up, there, and most likely I have some probably blood in Eastern Prussia. I'm not ruling that out. So again, I do not know where exactly my identity lies as of now. What does it mean to be identity? How do I define myself? I'm not ruling out. I might even come to Australia. As a matter of fact, I was going to ask you if you can set up a meeting with some of your colleagues. I'll be pleased to come there and talk about
working on that.
German national consciousness, about the German. Yes, this is one point, and I will be presenting the book. And this is being organized by, you may be familiar with Heimat. This is the former NPD folks. I've always had a relationship with them. They've toned down a little bit their rhetoric and so on, but Eisenach is a town down in central Germany. And of course, I'm looking forward to it because I'll be using the German language, the German idioms, and I'll be, of course, my book doesn't deal only with politics. It deals, of course, with this phenomenon of Homo Americanus. What does it mean? And my main point is how this Homo Americanus affected the German national consciousness. The Germans have a word, re-education, Umerziehung. Germany has been subjected to over the last years. So basically, even if you want to understand the European Union and by extension Germany, you got to put things in the perspective of 1945, because Germany is not a sovereign, full-fledged sovereign country. They have to abide by the canons, by the rules and regulations of people who run the show, given the fact that about 40,000 American soldiers still stationed on the territory. And then again, Germany, but under different circumstances, yes, I love the French language also. Now I read the French. And of course, I have good ties with the German, with the French folks as well. So basically, yes, I do not consider myself a tiny tribal type of a Croat nationalist like many of my good colleagues. They're good fighters, probably, and so on, but they're pretty much limited in their vision of Europe. As of now, and again, I repeat that before we knock off for today.
Yep.
Our biggest problem, regardless, your colleagues, my colleagues in Australia, regardless whether they're of the Serbian, Irish, Greek, Italian origin, should be how to preserve our European ancestry. Let's avoid those big-time words like race and National Socialism. This is all a non-starter, and this can get you into big problems. But let's just talk about how to preserve our national legacy. I'm talking national European legacy.
Yes,
and I don't mean necessarily by reading Nietzsche or some racial scholars like Gobineau, for that matter, whom I read very well, and I gave a lecture in French on Gobineau, or for that matter, Günther or Ludwig Klaus and so on, I'm also familiar with. But we should resuscitate our legacy going back to Homer, going back to Cicero and Seneca, you know. And of course, we should not exclude them from our legacy, because our legacy, our tradition, just doesn't go only to Jesus Christ. It goes far way back, even prior to Jesus.
Yeah, of course.
With all due respect for my Christian fellows and Catholic fellows down in Perth, you know. So this is something we got to be aware of. I'll tell you firsthand, I'm very much afraid and scared of what is going on right now in Europe and in Eastern Europe. Yeah, we have lost over the last 20 years more than 500,000 young Croats who fled to, who left for, European Union. They went to where the big buck is. They want to make a big buck, big money. Mm-hmm. And our demography is nothing. It's just we are the worst with Greece and Serbia. Serbia, can you imagine? Our demography is just nosediving. And
yes.
It's foolish to talk about the territory of the national consciousness where is the vacant country. And I guess this is something we got to be focused on, let alone that we got to, intermarry with our folks from all over Europe and Australia. So I would suggest you, and we'll finish with that. Come over here, Australians, whoever you are. God, so many younger, good-looking women looking for a husband.
Oh, no.
Serious folks, and women in their early 40s, they're looking for a mate. So please come here and get yourself a mate, and try to preserve your national consciousness.
Tom, I'd like to thank you for your comments tonight, and I'd like to reiterate that we have invited you to Australia. Now, I'll say off air shortly a couple of details for you that will not be part of our video, and so we can simply exchange some information. But I would sincerely hope that we can get you to Australia in 2026, more likely from the middle of the year on. There'll be certain reasons for that. Tom, thank you for talking to me tonight. You've been a feast, and good luck with your activities in Germany. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and best regards to our friends and our friends down under.